If you aren't already aware, Nintendo has a history of changing their packaging to suit the various regions that they release their games in. And as someone who personally likes collecting old Japanese Nintendo games, that's something I've always found really interesting. I find great enjoyment in going back and seeing what my favorite games looked like when they were displayed on Japanese store shelves years ago. Oftentimes, the image I have in my head of what a game's box should look like is completely overturned when I see how the game was marketed to people from different regions around the world. And I'm not just talking about box art, although that is something that's changed rather often. I'm also talking about stuff like box template and box shape, which usually don't get as much attention as the art, but can be just as interesting, if not more so, in my opinion. If you know me, you know I like to go into detail about some of the less popular things, so to speak, about gaming, and this video will surely be another example of that. So the plan is to go through each of Nintendo's home consoles and look at some examples of how they changed up their game marketing when it comes to packaging, and maybe learn a thing or two about how Nintendo likes to cater to specific regions along the way. Hopefully you guys will enjoy the ride. First up, we have the Famicom, or NES, depending on what region you live in, of course. And when it comes to this console, there is a good deal to talk about in terms of package differences, but let's start with what I'm sure most of my audience is familiar with, Ntsc Nes games. The first few waves of games that Nintendo released in North America are known as the Black Box NES games because of their iconic, mostly black boxes that featured simple sprite art on the cover as opposed to more detailed artist-designed box art. Other than the art and the black background of the box, these games all had another rather odd little detail in the bottom left corner of the box. That is the so-called series that Nintendo decided to assign each game, consisting of things like the Action series, the Arcade series, the Light Gun series, and even the Programmable series. These series brandings are particularly interesting to me because they illustrate a time where the general public didn't know much about how video games worked due to how new they were, and the fact that Nintendo felt they had to include some sort of large branding that told potential buyers what type of game they were actually buying right on the front cover. It's something you would never see these days, and that's what makes it so interesting to me. I mean, can you imagine if all Mario games still had a giant logo that said Action Game in the bottom right, or all Pokemon games had one that said RPG? That seems so weird to me for some reason, but I guess it could be helpful to some parents buying games for their kids. However, one thing that has stuck with NTSC Nintendo games since the Black Box NES games is the information that can be found on the back of the box. I was honestly a little surprised the first time I saw the back of one of these games because I wasn't expecting it to look so similar to what we know today. There's some text introducing and hyping up the game to the consumers, as well as some screenshots showing how the game actually looks. It's literally exactly the same as modern games, and I personally find that really cool. I wouldn't have been surprised if Nintendo changed everything about their packaging with subsequent consoles, so seeing that something like the layout of the reverse of a game box hasn't changed in several decades is super interesting to me. But moving on to the bulk of the NES games, we saw a rather drastic shift away from the standardized designs of the black box games to more unique and colorful game boxes. The fonts were all different, the art was no longer pixel art and instead favored artist depictions of the game, and of course the black background could be changed to any color the developers wanted. There were a few things that remained rather similar to the black box games though. For one thing, the information on the back of the box was largely unchanged, at least in terms of what was there, namely screenshots and text describing the game. The shape of the box and the vertical orientation of the design were also unchanged, perhaps to at least preserve some level of uniformity among the various NES titles. I personally much prefer this variant of NES game packaging because each game feels so much more unique and fun when compared to the very uniform and just plain bland black box games. If you put the original Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. 3 side by side, the better looking design is pretty clear, at least to me. As for the PAL region games, we don't really see too much of a difference to the NTSC NES games. The only real differences that I can spot are the large Mattel logo often found on PAL games, as well as the text that states those games can only be played on PAL systems. The NES was distributed by Mattel in PAL regions for some time, so that explains the logo, but Nintendo took over production later in the game, so some PAL NES games had that logo removed. It's pretty weird to see a huge Mattel logo plastered on Nintendo games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, but I guess that's just how things were for PAL players back in the day. But other than those few things, the games were exactly the same as those seen on the Ntsc Nes. However, when it comes to the Japanese Famicom, the differences are much greater. The first and possibly biggest difference is that the orientation of the box is horizontal rather than vertical. And this is true of most Famicom games, but there are a few exceptions that had vertical boxes similar to what we saw on the NES. It's up to personal preference whether you like vertical or horizontal game boxes, but personally I prefer my games be vertical because that makes them easier to store and display. Japan didn't have their own version of the black box games we got over here in the West, but the earlier Famicom games did have some level of variation when compared to later releases. The main difference being that the reverse of the box didn't feature any sort of information about the game. Usually there would just be some warnings about how to handle the cartridge, which is important, but the fun experience of looking at the pictures while you read the back of the box was not to be had with these early Famicom games. Later games did include information about the game on the back of the box, however. Another difference to many NES games, as I'm sure you've already noticed, is the box art. Not only did Famicom games start out with full artistic depictions of the game, they also very often had box art that differed from what we saw on the NES. I've talked about this before, but I personally don't understand why box art needs to be changed across regions. If the reasoning is that Nintendo wants to cater the art to the region they're releasing the game in, I definitely can't get behind that. Why mess with something that someone used their creativity to design just because you think it might not sell as well? I mean, you can't even be sure the original box wouldn't have sold more, so why even change it? But I think we should probably move on to the next Nintendo home console before I get even more heated about this. The consoles that followed the NES and Famicom respectively were the Super NES and the Super Famicom. The Super NES is touted as having many of the greatest games of all time, but how did the packaging look? Well, let's just say it was a pretty big change from the NES. Most Super NES games in the NTSC regions had a big old black border that encompassed the perimeter of the box with a rectangular space towards the left side of the cover that was meant for the art. Not all games follow this template, but for the most part that's what we saw. Personally, I am not a fan of the black border that Nintendo included on most of the SNES games because it once again made the boxes too uniform and boring for my tastes. In fact, the reason I decided to make this video was because I wanted to talk about how much I dislike this particular box layout. The Super NES is one of my absolute favorite consoles, but the NTSC boxes with their huge black borders just aren't my cup of tea at all. And to make matters worse, all the Super NES games are oriented horizontally as opposed to the vertical-oriented NES games that I much prefer. Also, what is the deal with those yellow dots on the right side of the box? Why are they there? What purpose do they serve? They just make the box look even more cluttered and weird in my opinion. Now the back of the SNES boxes follow the same template I was talking about earlier, so I won't be talking about them again, and the same can be said for future consoles. But if there's something special about the reverse side of a particular console's games, I will mention it, so don't worry. As far as PAL goes, we once again see very similar boxes to the NTSC games, but there are a few differences. The best change that was made is that most PAL games ditch the black border in favor of one that suits the game's art, and that's a great change in my opinion. However, it doesn't fix the box completely in my eyes, as the general template does remain the same. Another difference is that the main rectangle of art has been shifted from the left side to the right side. This was done to potentially further differentiate PAL from NTSC. There is also a big bold piece of text that says PAL version in the bottom left, so that helps too. I do like the PAL SNES games better than the NTSC SNES games, but in my opinion neither hold a candle to the Super Famicom boxes. Super Famicom boxes are mostly vertical, which is nice. They feature a more elongated shape compared to the fat SNES games, which gives them a sleeker looking design in general in my opinion, and to top it all off, the boxes don't use some weird border to try to make everything uniform. The developers had free reign to color their boxes whatever color they wanted, and they could put their box art wherever they wanted on the box. This all leads to a much more visually appealing design in my opinion, and makes each game feel truly unique, which I love to see. Nintendo essentially took the later version of the NES game box and just made it better, which is the big reason why I personally can't get enough of collecting these guys. They're also super cheap right now, so I'd say if you're interested, consider picking some up sooner rather than later. Moving on to Nintendo's next console, the Nintendo 64, we can see that, for the most part, Nintendo followed the general templates that were laid out for game packaging with the SNES. Once again, let's start out with the North American games. They were horizontally oriented, which I'm not going to get into again. But the main thing here is that the black border of the SNES games has turned into a translucent red one that's only located on the right side. Red being one of the main colors associated with the N64, it makes sense to see it here. The other main colors, namely blue, yellow, and green, are also present on different sides of the box as other translucent overlays. I'm personally not a big fan of these overlays because they obscure what should be the main attraction here, the art. The only purpose they have is to say, hey, this is an N64 game. Did you know that? It's an N64 game. It's just obnoxious in my opinion. But other than those overlays, there really isn't too much to talk about here, so let's move on to PAL. And oh boy, did they get the short end of the stick. PAL N64 games, for the most part, take the North American box art or potentially new box art and just stick it in the middle of a giant black border, this time one that covers the entire perimeter of the box, and you know how I feel about that. One thing to note is that the backs of these boxes are usually exactly the same as the backs of North American boxes, save for a few small changes. It's pretty weird to me that even after changing the fronts, they just left the back the same because in a lot of cases it makes the back and front feel very disjointed in my opinion. Say what you will about the North American games, but at least they had a sense of connection. The PAL version of Ocarina of Time does look pretty cool though. But as you might expect, my favorite N64 boxes are those found in Japan. Like I said before, they are very similar to the layout of the Super Famicom boxes. They are of course vertical for the most part, but the boxes are a bit wider than what we saw on the Super Famicom. I'd say they were just a Western box turned on its side, but I can't be sure. And once again, there is no border in sight, which makes me very happy. I know I'm extremely biased towards Japanese box design, but I think that's fine. If you personally prefer the Western designs, more power to you. I personally just prefer the uniqueness and overall shape of these early Japanese Nintendo games. But anyway, there's not really much else to talk about here, so let's move on to our next console. I'm sure you guys already know the next system on the list is the Nintendo GameCube. But before we dive in, there's something we have to note. And that is that from here on out, there really won't be much difference between a North American game and a PAL game. There may be a few box art changes here and there, but for the most part, they will be identical in overall template, so I'll just be combining the two into a Western version. And the Western version of the GameCube game box is pretty simplistic. You've got the box art that covers most of the front section of the box, and a small portion on the top that specifies the game as for the GameCube. For better or for worse, depending on your opinion of course, the boxes are also back to a vertical orientation, which I'm sure you know I like. Also, since the media of Nintendo games has shifted to discs, the boxes have also become much thinner. For me, this can be considered a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. It's good that you can fit more games on a shelf, but the boxes don't have the heft to them that they used to, which always made them feel really good to hold and open up in my opinion. Also, Western GameCube games use plastic boxes as opposed to cardboard, which is another rather divisive topic. In a perfect world, I'd like every game box to be cardboard, but in reality they weather and wear very easily, which is not ideal. However, plastic boxes just feel cheaper and more mass-produced to me, which I do not like very much at all. It's up to you which you prefer, but for me it's a toss-up. But that's not the case with Japanese GameCube games. If you didn't already know, Japanese GameCube games use a two-tiered box structure, which sounds really interesting, but it really just amounts to putting a cardboard sleeve on a plastic box. It's simple, but it makes all the difference in my opinion. Having the same cardboard feel from the sleeve and the protection and reliability of the plastic box makes Japanese GameCube games the best of both worlds in my opinion. I wish this idea would have caught on and continued past just the GameCube, because it's such a neat idea. Another thing that differentiates Japanese GameCube games from Western ones is the size of the box. It is much, much smaller. Probably about half the size of a Western game. What drove Nintendo to make this decision? I don't know, but I do think it gives the games a sort of cuteness that we haven't really seen on any console up to this point. I like it a lot. And as for which overall design I prefer, I'd once again have to go with Japan, but this one was much closer than previous consoles. I do enjoy the Western design of GameCube games, but it's just the extra touches like the cardboard sleeve and the small size that push the Japanese version over the top for me. And that's our last console. Whew, I sure am glad we were able to get through everything. What's that? I'm missing like 3 consoles? Well, it turns out that I'm really not. Every console from the Wii to the Switch uses uniform designs for their game boxes across regions, so they're not really something I'd say is worth talking about. Of course, there are some variations in box art when it comes to certain games, but for the most part, games have been pretty uniform for the last 15 years or so. If there's one thing I would like to mention though, it's that the Switch brought back these small-sized boxes from the GameCube era, and I quite like that. It's a shame there's no cardboard sleeve, but you can't ask for too much. Anyway, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video, it always means a lot. Unless you just skipped here from the beginning, in which case you're dead to me. I'm just kidding, I appreciate you guys too. Hopefully you enjoyed the ride, and if you have any opinions on the game boxes we talked about here today, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's video, consider giving it a like, it's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Hack out. It really makes you feel like you're holding cardboard. That's an IGN joke. You know how they said, it really makes you feel like you're Spider-Man. Yeah, that. I don't know, I thought it was funny. Can we do a take 2 on that?